The massively multiplayer online role-playing game genre is in decline. I know this must be true because the internet has been proclaiming it for the past 20 years. I'm old enough to remember the prophesized death of the MMO back in 2003 with EverQuest, before World of Warcraft was even released. And it was a decade ago, in 2013, 1 year before Elder Scrolls Online released, that noted MMORPG scholar Professor Richard A. Bartle of the University of Essex published his seminal white paper on the decline of MMOs, predicting the fall of the industry. And yet here we are in 2023 and the MMORPG is still chugging along. Player numbers for old guard MMOs like World of Warcraft remain near peak levels, and relative newcomers like Lost Ark and Final Fantasy XIV Realm Reborn have pulled in big impressive numbers and continue to grow. Why it seems like the demand for MMORPGs appears larger than ever. This video is not about the decline of the MMORPG as a genre per se. This video is actually about Galapagos finches. Just kidding. This video is a lawyer's proposition that the modern MMORPG is not as quote-unquote good as it could be, and as such is not capturing the vast market that wants to enjoy a meaningful MMORPG experience. In other words, it is my opinion that bad design philosophy in the industry is leading to a failure of MMORPGs to meet market demand, to the detriment of even the most hardcore current players. My theory is this: there are fundamentally three kinds of multiplayer online role-playing games. There is the action RPG or Diablo-like, the social RPG or MapleStory-like, and the hybridized power fantasy RPG or World of Warcraft-like. The third category, the hybridized power fantasy, is the optimal category where a top-selling MMO should be, and where the lion's share of market demand resides. But the modern MMO feels unfulfilling, and even antisocial, because the balance between action RPG and social RPG has been so heavily disrupted towards the action RPG side, towards the pursuit of pure power, to the detriment of all players, including those who do play MMOs for the big numbers and the careful builds. In other words, a good MMO is an MMO that successfully realizes both action RPG power-focused gameplay and social RPG community-focused roleplay, without one being overly adulterated to compromise for the other in such a way that the power fantasy aspect of the MMORPG becomes fully realized. If the perfect MMO is a balance between vertical power ascension and horizontal socialization, the modern MMO dev has sacrificed the body of these MMOs, making them inaccessible and hollow. Which brings us to the analysis proper. We'll start by breaking down each of the three multiplayer online RPG categories and identifying their strengths and weaknesses. Armed then with context, we will examine how developer overemphasis on the ARPG side has led to a less fun experience for everyone playing MMOs. And finally, we will look at some proposed solutions to this problem. But first, a word from our sponsor, Factor. When I used to play Guild Wars 2, one of my favorite activities in that game was cooking, but boy, I did not enjoy grinding for ingredients. And real life is very much the same way, isn't it? You want to eat well, but it takes a lot of time to go to the grocery store and to sort your ingredients and to cook. And all of that time arranging your mise en place is time you could have spent grinding for gear. Factor is a service that delivers fresh and never frozen high-quality meals to your door that are ready to eat in just 2 minutes. You heat your Factor meal, eat and go. Factor was kind enough to send me a few meals, and I've got to say, I'm quite impressed. These are meals prepared by chefs, approved by dietitians, and that feature quality, toothsome ingredients. I am a terrible foodie, and if I found these meals delicious, I'm certain that you will too. Give Factor a try, and head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code MOONCHANNEL50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Once again, that's Factor75.com with code MOONCHANNEL50. And now that we've had our fill of Factor, let us get back to the video games. There are three fundamental types of multiplayer online role-playing game. The action RPG, which I will refer to as an ARPG, the social RPG, which for the purposes of this video I will refer to as an SRPG, which I know normally stands for strategy RPG, and the hybrid power fantasy RPG, which I will refer to as the MMO. It is important to have these terms as anchors, but I think it is also helpful to visualize the action social spectrum by creating a chart, with ARPG mechanics on the vertical axis and the SRPG mechanics on the horizontal axis. An online RPG that is more action and less social sits here in the top left section of the compass. And an online RPG that is more social and has less action sits here at the bottom right. The bottom left portion of the axis starts to wander outside of the purview of multiplayer online games, This is a zone of decreasing socialization and decreasing competition, meaning essentially a single-player experience. Online RPGs that increasingly resemble single-player experiences may find themselves drifting in this direction, and that is sometimes a purposeful design decision. Look at this chart. Where do you suppose the perfect MMO goes, the hybrid game? Well, I posit that it's not here in the center, but up here in the top right. The interesting thing about plotting the three fundamental types of multiplayer online RPGs as a spectrum in this way is that we get a much stronger impression of why the MMORPG as a genre is so revolutionary and such a success conceptually. The perfect MMO is not a balance per se of action and social where focusing on one removes from the other. It is a realization of both, the best of both worlds and not a compromise. In any case, before we really get into the weeds of what a good MMO should be, let us start by considering the fundamentals. I think the most helpful of the three fundamental online RPGs to start with is the ARPG or Action RPG. At its core, an action RPG is a story-driven, role-playing game where a player has real-time control over their character and can directly influence the outcome of a battle in-game through their reflexes. However, the way we are understanding an ARPG here is not by the underlying mechanics, but the perception of what an ARPG is. Instead of trying to visualize the abstract, let's just call a spade a spade. The online ARPG is the Diablo-like, and it has the distinctive characteristics that set it apart from single-player ARPG experiences like Xenoblade Chronicles. The Diablo-like ARPG is most easily identified by its pursuit of pure power. The story is secondary to chasing the most effective performance in battle, be it the biggest numbers, fastest boss clear time, etc. The online ARPG, the Diablo-like, is vertical by nature. There is a clear bottom and a clear top of the hierarchy. If your build is poor, or your level is low, or your gear is trash, you are identifiably a worse player than someone whose build is good, whose level is high, and who is all geared up. As such, ARPGs require tight mechanics and mindful balancing. If your game has an enemy that negates the action part of Action RPG by killing you in one shot from off-screen in a way that you cannot action out of, then the mechanics are a failure. And if the patch notes can swing a player wildly into a higher or lower tier of performance, the balancing for the ARPG is also a failure. And the very hierarchical nature of power in an ARPG means that it is always semi-competitive, even if there is no PvP ladder to climb per se. If the point of the game is to be the most powerful, and you are struggling with your Whirlwind Barb to kill Uber Lilith, while the Bone Spear Necro can do it in like 3 seconds, even though you aren't directly competing for some prize, the game feels less fun. When the ARPG spectrum is pushed further past Diablo, we get games like Path of Exile, which are great fun for gamers who are invested in the pursuit of pure power, but which is overly complicated and impenetrable for many a casual player, who will take one look at the skill tree or at the in-game economy and opt to play something else instead of getting a bachelor's degree in Tornado Shot Deadeye. And at the furthest end of the ARPG spectrum is the Korean Hypersweat Deep Grind RPG. These games often attempt social RPG inclusion, but that inclusion is perfunctory. The point of the game is to amass power, and such power requires extreme, almost Osu-like precision, requires everyone to squeeze numbers out of nearly identical optimal builds, and requires an endless, brutal amount of grinding. If you want to do the hardest content and you aren't perfect, you aren't invited. You are literally not able to play as much as a quarter of the game if you aren't willing to dedicate yourself to the pursuit of pure power. As the ARPG advances to the furthest end of the spectrum, the RP, the role-playing, disappears, and the game becomes essentially a competitive action game. Let's move on now to the social RPG, but please keep in mind the characteristics and flaws you can already see in the ARPG. ARPGs are simple fun because they have clear objectives. They offer a simple work-reward loop. However, the heavier a game leans into the ARPG direction, the more it focuses on a pursuit of pure power, and the less accessible it necessarily must be, as power is only powerful relative to someone else's lack of power, which therein requires ever-increasing difficulty, and thereby exclusivity. The social RPG, on the other hand, is not about getting to the biggest numbers, and it often purposefully eschews that narrow competitive scope. The social RPG is a way to hang out with friends, instead of being very vertically designed, where those who are higher level have better gear and the best builds are the top players. The SRPG is horizontally designed. It is very possible that the enviable person in your group is not the top level guy in raid gear, but the one with the cool hair and neat angel wing skin that dropped off some rare blob in the starting zone. That's the person that everyone envies. For you see, in a social RPG, doing everything the game has to offer is not the point. Just as how many ARPG players will never fight the hardest bosses in those games, many SRPG players will never engage with a lot of the content the game has to offer, as the content is just a backdrop for socialization. In an SRPG, balance concerns are secondary to content concerns, meaning having that summer beach event with cool new skins, a new place to hang out, and cutely designed crab mobs that might drop some event currency or items is more important to the success of the game than making sure that barbarians and necromancers both have options to kill the game's hardest boss with the same relative difficulty. When this side of the spectrum is pushed to its limits, unlike the ARPG where the RP exits the equation, in the SRPG it is the G, the game, that disappears.
Second Life is not a game.
It's a multi-user virtual environment.
The same evolution of human behavior that you see in emerging societies.
The SRPG taken to its furthest extent becomes Second Life or VR Chat or Habbo Hotel, platforms that aren't really games anymore but are avenues for socialization and for roleplay. There is, I think, an impression amongst the Sweatlord Path of Exile ARPG folks that the gamers in this category are casual gamers, but I think that is a misnomer. There are people who play MapleStory for 12 hours a day just like you do for Path of Exile. They're just chilling with their friends, socializing, hitting stumps with daggers, and wasting time. It is just as hardcore as it involves just as much of an investment of time and maybe even mental resources, but the pursuit is not pure power. The pursuit is community, or perhaps more abstractly, belonging. Likewise, it is inaccurate to look at the SRPG and say, oh, this is a more accessible genre than the ARPG, when I don't believe that this is the case. The SRPG is more accessible to certain players, but as one goes further into the spectrum, it also becomes just as inaccessible. You might be willing to play, say, Ragnarok Online or RuneScape, but how long would you be willing to play Second Life? And at the end of the day, the player count really tells the full story. Yes, MapleStory is still popular, but Diablo 4 is the top game right now, and arguably it is the most accessible by nature of being relatively tame in the ARPG direction. And so, now that we understand the constituent parts of the MMORPG, the hybridized power fantasy, let us look at what makes an MMORPG good, and then we can take a look at why modern MMORPGs don't seem to be resonating with audiences. When World of Warcraft was first released, it accomplished what no other game, not even EverQuest, really managed to do. It completely and fundamentally understood what makes the MMORPG as a genre great. It combined engaging action gameplay with engaging social gameplay in what I would argue is a realization of both, the power fantasy. And whether this was purposeful or accidental, World of Warcraft powerfully emphasized the secret sauce of MMORPGs, the elusive holy grail of the hybrid game, organic, unforced, emergent gameplay. For you see, when the hierarchical systems of the ARPG meet the social systems of the SRPG, what emerges is something resembling the drama of real life. When I played WoW back in the first one, I distinctly remember running my baby-faced Alliance human mage character through a field and getting killed by player-controlled horde rogues. I then came back, this time more carefully, only to be hunted down and killed again, and then a third time. So I went back to Stormwind with my hapless human mage, went up to the toughest looking guy I could find and begged him to help my poor useless self to stop the vile horde rogues. He brought his friends. We went back and the rogues were smushed. Only for the rogues to come back with their own big scary guys and a huge battle to break out where increasing numbers were called in to fight. It was awesome. I think. It's been a while, so forgive me if I'm misremembering how this all works a little bit. But if those well-geared epic heroes weren't hanging around the starting city showing off their cool appearances and spells, this emergent experience would become impossible. And if there wasn't some appreciable power scaling between my hapless mage and the horde rogues and the epic hero, this emergent experience would also become impossible. Old original World of Warcraft back in the day, before the image of WoW became tainted by the pursuit of pure power, was one of the greatest video game experiences that ever existed, and anyone who was around back then can attest to that. The game was satisfying for those who wanted to chill and socialize, and you could do so even while beating up a raid boss to some extent. The game was full of those who wanted to troll, or to explore, or to troll and explore while hanging out together. The game had room for those who wanted to push the limits and go all out, and the game had room for people who wanted to chill in Stormwind all the time and chat. In other words, what made old WoW great was how rounded the experience was. It wasn't here in the center, it was here in the top right. It realized the potential for social and action gameplay and combined them such that each complemented the other instead of clashing with the other. Every MMORPG that has followed World of Warcraft has tried to chase the same dragon, but I would argue few or none have ever caught the dragon as WoW did. There were some games that didn't invest enough into the social aspect but tried to force emergent gameplay. Other games went too hard into the social aspect but without meaningful action gameplay to back it up, and thus felt a bit hollow. I would even argue that one or two modern MMOs hit the mark but slid in different directions due to perhaps not understanding how they hit the mark to begin with. The games that are the most lasting often don't even try to shoot for the golden ratio, they try to dig a niche in their own direction. Consider EVE Online, which is much larger parts social than action in the recipe, but nevertheless allows for emergent if at times deeply inaccessible gameplay. Or a game like Vindictus, which just abandons most of the pretenses of a typical role-playing game and becomes an online action game almost entirely. Or the very many single-player MMO-esque action RPGs which fall into the bottom left corner of the chart but are still beloved and played by many. If one puts aside those niche games for a moment and one looks at the earnest attempts to create the next WoW, I think a pattern emerges which brings us to the crux of the video, the point that all the context reinforces. Many so-called WoW killer MMOs and even WoW itself share one characteristic in common. There is too much pursuit of pure power, and it is ruining the experience for everyone. The action RPG, as we defined above, is characterized by the pursuit of pure power. Big numbers go up, boss dies faster, loot comes quicker, character becomes more powerful. However, let us say you are playing Elden Ring and you're fighting a boss and the boss takes you 5 minutes to kill with your spells. How would you gauge your performance? Well, I didn't take too many hits, the boss is dead, I'm alive, I did great. I get to move on and see the rest of the story. But then let's say you go online and you discover everyone thinks that this boss is a joke. Nobody has ever died to this boss and it takes the average person maybe 20 seconds to kill it, and using magic is cheating. Well, suddenly maybe you feel like you didn't do as good a job as you thought. The pursuit of pure power is ultimately fueled by competition, whether that is competition with others or competition with yourself. There is no drive to pursue power unless there is some definition of weakness that exists relative to power. It feels good to be powerful, it is mentally rewarding to conquer increasingly difficult content, and it is doubly rewarding to feel like you are conquering said content better than everyone else. However, comparison is the thief of joy, and just as the competitive aspects of pursuing pure power can be a motivator, it can also completely remove the joy in an activity. For you see, the harder any online game leans into any side of the spectrum, the less accessible the game becomes. Second Life is opaque and unfun to the hardcore ARPG gamer, and PoE is opaque and unfun to the hardcore SRPG gamer. And while an ARPG leaning into ARPG mechanics can still survive or even thrive, because it is swimming in a pool of ARPG players and vice versa for SRPGs, the MMORPG decidedly cannot thrive if it decides to lean too heavily in one direction or another, because the all-encompassing nature of the MMORPG, the hybrid, power fantasy, requires a realization of social and action together. In other words, players who want to play an MMORPG are here for the masterful blend. If they wanted an SRPG latte, they'd play MapleStory. If they wanted an ARPG double espresso, they'd play Path of Exile. If you boot up World of Warcraft, you are not logging in so that you can play Path of Exile. The modern MMORPG has tilted too heavily towards the pursuit of pure power, at the expense of the social RPG aspects that round out the experience and make it meaningful. Your girlfriend is not going to play World of Warcraft with you if your raid party is full of more dots guy. Do you get what I'm saying? A lot of modern MMORPGs, including World of Warcraft, Lost Ark, and although I'm not quite as familiar with them, Black Desert Online, RuneScape, and almost every single alleged WoW killer MMO, is focusing too much on big damage numbers, ultra-hard endgame content that requires perfect gear and/or technique to beat, and cutting out what they see as fat. This fat, though, is the social content of the game, the body of the game. The social aspects of MMORPGs are what attract a lot of new players. The opportunity to kill a big scary boss and sometimes be carried because you don't know what you are doing is a thrilling experience. It shouldn't be the case that the scary boss is an insta-fail if one person is new, thereby necessitating throwing all new players out. There should be reasons to visit old zones, reasons to hang out in starting cities, reasons to check out lands from prior DLCs, instead of just constantly being railroaded to the hardest and newest thing in the game until the next hardest thing releases. We'll talk more in depth about my proposed solutions to the problem of overfocusing on pure power in the next section of the video. Before we do though, I'm going to close out this section by offering a controversial statement here. MMORPG developers shouldn't be listening too much to their power-focused players. This statement isn't insinuating that these power-focused players are even necessarily a minority or that they are wrong within the specific scope of their balancing requests. It is just that those players have the most to gain or lose through dev behavior, and as such naturally, they will complain the most and they will complain the loudest. When one decides to balance not just the game, but the experience of the game around the sweatiest players, do not be surprised when the game becomes inaccessible to anyone but those players. A developer that is hyper-reactive to only the loudest voices, as opposed to proactive through understanding the community as a whole, inexorably causes their game to become increasingly dominated by an exclusive community of top players who cannot tolerate so-called weaker players. And as those weaker players leave the game, the voices of those pursuit of power players grows louder and more demanding, reinforcing the cycle. And this affects even the experience of those top players who find that their servers feel a bit empty or that the other content they sometimes enjoy, like PvP, is unpopulated. The overfocus on a pursuit of pure power also causes factions to concentrate in certain servers. If the focus of the game is purely power, then why would you play in a server where it is more difficult or impossible to obtain the highest levels of power because of a faction imbalance, or even a faction non-dominance? And ultimately remember, the pursuit of pure power is only interesting because there are people to be more powerful than, and if you scare away all the people, the pursuit of power becomes meaningless and the game unrewarding. Here's where the devs should be stepping in to nip the cycle for the benefit of all players, including the power players. It is the developer's job to predict what the player base, including the quiet social base, actually wants, actually needs, and then to act on it instead of reacting to the demands of only the most vocal players or, God forbid, just randomly implementing whatever changes they want to see pursuant to internal design documents without any conceptualization of what the player base is looking for at all. And speaking of what devs can do, let's take a look at what solutions to this problem might look like. It is easy enough to critique after all, but to offer solutions is a different beast entirely. How can we expand these social aspects of MMORPGs without necessarily affecting the action aspects? How do we fully realize both social and action RPG gameplay in an MMO such that we can hit the sweet spot of power fantasy without alienating either kind of player? Well, the solutions, I think, are myriad if one fully understands the problem. If we assume that an optimal MMORPG is a realization of both ARPG and SRPG characteristics and that the modern MMORPG leans too far towards the ARPG side, we can observe SRPG games to add that content into the MMORPG to realize the social aspects of the game more fully. And we can observe the ARPG side to pull back the MMO from indulging in the extremes of that genre. Starting then with realization of the social characteristics of an MMORPG, a good first step is to leverage customization to boost the social nature of the game. What do I mean by this? If you sell cosmetics in a real currency item shop, in the manner of mobile games, you are removing the joy of finding that cosmetic in the real world, and in so doing, you are removing emergent social gameplay. Consider the simple social joy of sharing a new rare cosmetic drop with your friends. Getting a new mount or a new great axe skin or a new pretty dress is awesome, but it is especially awesome when that new content is both exclusive due to its rarity and this is my second point, tradable. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to have items in a game involving drops be soulbound. What is the benefit here? Are the stash tabs using too much memory? When gear is soulbound, cosmetics included and cannot be traded, an important social aspect that distinguishes MMORPGs from pure ARPGs or even offline RPGs is lost. Consider this. If a member of your guild only has like 3 hours to play a week and you love playing your MMORPG of choice with them, it is socially interesting gameplay to be able to grind on their behalf, present them with that cool new armor, and then play a raid together where your friend isn't undergeared and thereby a liability. And if that friend happens to get a cool new mount drop from that raid, well, they can give it to you after if they choose to as thanks. That's a core memory right there. That is social emergent gameplay that is unnecessarily lost when items are soulbound. But if the gear isn't soulbound, doesn't that diminish the value of the gear? Doesn't that make the gear too easy for some to obtain instead of playing the game? Couldn't someone just buy the best gear in the game? Well, yes. And I think that this is a sacrifice on the ARPG side of the equation that might have to be made, as obtaining the gear in some way that isn't directly playing the game's content is social and emergent gameplay, and to some extent is healthy for an MMORPG, in a way that it might not necessarily be for an ARPG, where the only purpose is pursuit of power. The pursuit of power places extreme importance on the value of gear pursuant to numbers, but not around the value of the gameplay experiences pursuant to gear. If we can acknowledge that the point of an MMO is not necessarily to kill the hardest raid boss with the greatest efficiency, but that there is some more meaningful social experience also implicated in playing an MMORPG, then soul-binding equipment should be done very sparingly or not at all. And speaking of equipment, I also think that gear-related level or stat restrictions might be a bad idea. Let's say you are playing a low-level mage in a low-level zone, and you work with randoms to kill a much stronger enemy than your level would otherwise allow, and it drops a glowing two-handed sword. You pick it up and can use it even though the stats aren't necessarily complementary, but because it is so strong relative to your level, you can go around swinging this sword destroying things you shouldn't be able to while also casting spells in support. That is emergent social gameplay. It promotes interesting interactions with other players and with the environment. That other party of newbie mages you run into is going to have a blast when they see you cast an ice bolt and then charge a kobold with a two-handed sword. But what about the balance? Won't that make you overpowered for the area? Well, yes. And that's awesome. The ARPG pursuit of pure power cares enormously about how overpowered you might be for an area. A perfectly balanced game is the pursuit of power taken to the extreme, and MMORPGs need to accept that leaning away from perfect balance might be to their benefit. Remember that the fully realized MMORPG is the power fantasy game. It is SRPG and ARPG combined, and thus it is both okay and perhaps even desirable for the player to be overpowered. Which brings me to my next point, level scaling. What is level scaling? Level scaling is a game mechanic wherein the enemies you fight power up as you level so that the game's enemies can constantly provide a challenge to the player. Level scaling is a terrible artificial mechanic that is ARPG pursuit of power balancing at its absolute worst. And if it must be employed, it needs to be used so delicately that if a player can notice it, the mechanic has not only failed, it has backfired by making the game less fun. I understand the motivation behind it. Number one, you want to give players the option to stay in a zone they like so that they can stay there longer and level with appropriate mobs. And number two, you want overleveled friends playing with lower level friends the opportunity to enjoy combat even though they should be too strong for the area. However, this streamlining of the experience detracts from social gameplay and cripples the capacity for emergent experiences. Level scaling keeps you from exploring the game. It keeps you from new areas, new people, and new experiences. Level scaling prevents you from trying new things on new enemies. It enforces the tedium of the grind and railroads the player experience towards the ARPG pursuit of power. If you don't keep up your power level, however that is measured relative to the enemy level scaling, you are becoming less powerful as you level up, which sucks. And so everyone is required to get with the pursuit of power program to the detriment of the social aspects of the game. I've alluded to the solution to this issue, and that is better game design. Let's consider what a poorly designed zone looks like and then compare that poor design to a zone from a game with masterful zone design in Elden Ring. A poorly designed zone has pockets of enemies, all level scaling, perhaps some a slightly higher default level than others, maybe one or two quest-related bosses, and various NPCs to give quests to kill those pockets of enemies scattered around. If the zone is designed for levels 1 through 15, once you are level 15, there is no reason to ever come back. And if you get to level 15, there is no reason to visit any of the other 6 zones that are also designed for players from level 1 to 15. In Elden Ring, the starting zone has enemies of a lot of different difficulties. Sure, the foot knights are easy and don't drop anything too good after a while, but there are genuinely difficult challenges milling around that area as well. The enemies are highly variable. Most players can't take on the big scary tree knight guy upon emerging, and that's okay. You can level in this zone until you feel strong enough to take on the next zone, and that pace is one you set yourself. You have reasons to return to this zone too, be it for meaningful collectibles, rare drops from certain enemies, or to take on the big knight. Imagine an MMO zone designed this way, where instead of these pockets of similarly leveled enemies, you have some of those pockets, but also a big boss with a set path that doesn't aggro and drops a unique weapon or mount. Some bird creatures 10 levels above normal that are non-aggro that have crafting parts, and one part of the zone with aggro enemies about 5 levels higher than the suggested level range, such that you could beat them with a group of friends or with a lot of individual effort in exchange for unique and interesting rewards. Imagine being a new player stumbling into that zone and watching a few level 100 players tackling the big boss. There are thunderbolts flying around and trees getting knocked over. Wouldn't that be an awesome experience? That is social emergent gameplay at work. You, the new player, will also one day want to come back and slay the big boss. Experiences that emerge from thoughtful level design foster an MMORPG's social aspects, and that adds substantially to the wonder, to the power fantasy of the game, as opposed to just the pursuit of pure power. And speaking of coming back to slay the big boss, the pursuit of pure power style of the modern MMORPG also lends itself towards railroading new players to endgame content. It's the ARPG layout: bloated early game, bloated endgame, nothing in between. It is catastrophic for new players to have to play a game Lost Ark style for 30 to 40 hours before they can even reach the real content, or for new players to be railroaded from level 1 to max level just to do the content in the latest expansion and then wait until the next expansion to play. Why even bother with a leveling experience if it is just there to be a gate to the real content? There's this enormous void that is just not filled out, and better zone design, better enemy design, and more social gameplay aspects, be it loot drops or content, or even events as silly as a beach event in some old DLC area that has a unique currency, associated cosmetics and drops, can all breathe life into the modern MMORPG. Now don't get me wrong, there should be room to chase the endgame hardest content, but there should be room as well just to chill with your friends in some random zone you leveled past months ago to enjoy some casual fishing for a meaningful reward. And I think using developer resources to fill out that middle game, providing rewards in that content that even highest level players will go back for, is a better use of resources than pushing the envelope of pure power over and over again, and then having to reactively tweak those numbers pursuant to the complaints of power players. I'm even of the opinion that the hardest endgame raids could be tweaked in certain ways that allow for more dynamic gameplay and options. If you play, for example, a MOBA, you know that if one of the members in your friend group isn't quite as good at the game, you can stick them in the support role and they'll have a great time. What if there were some raids where you need a specific kind of cleric, warlock, or mage to optimally succeed, but the design of the raid was kind of protect the president style, where the actual job of said mage is pretty easy but very important, and the hard part of the raid is protecting that person. Look, there are all kinds of ideas I could propose, but I think you get the picture. And I admit too, not all of these ideas are fits-all solutions. But by simply pulling the design philosophy of an MMORPG away from the pursuit of pure power, and pushing the design philosophy slightly, not totally, just slightly, towards community building, social RPG characteristics, one opens up all kinds of creative options that can restore the realized power fantasy balance of the MMORPG genre. Which is all to say that it feels like there aren't any good MMORPGs because we stopped making good MMORPGs. We have, what? Final Fantasy XIV, which is in danger of sliding towards the bottom left quadrant, and Guild Wars 2, which is somewhere here in the middle, and that's it. The modern MMORPG has developed into a glorified ARPG, and the overemphasis on the pursuit of pure power and design has produced a limited experience tailored only to the players of highest mechanical skill and competitive vigor, which slowly chokes half the content and at least half the player base out of the MMORPG genre. Market research shows that there is a substantial, hungry audience for a good MMO. The demands of this audience, though, are not being met, and the reason these demands aren't being met is that developers have fundamentally lost sight of what makes the MMORPG a special game. There is a divide between developer design philosophy and what gamers actually want, not what they say they want, but what they actually want. And for our part, we gamers are playing games so efficiently that we are losing sight of fun in the process. I'm not saying that we have to turn World of Warcraft into Roblox, but I am saying that we gamers and developers both are actively turning World of Warcraft into Diablo, and that is a serious mistake. My proposition is not some pioneering new idea, it is merely returning what worked about the genre to the genre, and replacing social content cut due to greedy, mobile game-esque monetization practices with increasing ARPG characteristics is not sufficient to fix this issue, because the ARPG characteristics were never the problem to begin with. There are three fundamental kinds of online role-playing game: the action RPG, the social RPG, and the MMORPG. The action RPG focuses on pursuit of pure power, the social RPG focuses on fostering a feeling of community and belonging, and the MMORPG is not merely a compromise between the two, but a realization of both. And if any game can fully realize and capture that potential, we may just see a second golden age of MMORPGs. I hope this new style of video was interesting for you. Please share your thoughts with me. I am always eager to see what you think. And if you liked this video, why not check out Adam Millard, the architect of gaming's recent video on role-playing games as a whole. It is a fascinating watch, especially if you're a fan of Galapagos finches. In any case, I've been your host, Mooney, and thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.
Oh, dude, 4 strength, 4 stam, leather belt. Level 18. Throw more nuts, more nuts. Come on, more nuts. Okay, some nuts. Now hit it very hard and very fast. Lee, run to the center. Mogress, run